Hey everyone, this is Tim with Little Crow Gunworks. Today we're doing a video on a product of ours called the World's Finest Trimmer. It is a trimmer for trimming rifle cartridge brass, I guess some pistol cartridge brass. It's designed for trimming bottleneck cartridges or cartridges that have a shoulder. So the reason we're doing this video is to answer a lot of questions that we get, common questions that we get over and over. To try to help people out and decide what trimmer is right for them, the differences between the different trimmers, what they can do and what they can't do. So the first thing we would say is that because of the design of the trimmers, they're designed to index off the shoulder of the brass. So each of these, we call them trim chambers. Each of these trim chamber inserts are cut with a chamber reamer, the same as the barrel of your gun. So that's how the trimmer indexes off the piece of brass and knows where to stop. So in order for the trimmer to work properly, there has to be a shoulder for it to rest on. So no shoulder means no trimmer. We get a lot of calls about making trimmers for straight wall cases, and we can't because of the design. It has to have a shoulder to sit on. So that's probably the most common question we get. Next would be the differences between the trimmers. So we sell 3 different versions. One of them is what we call the World's Finest Trimmer Original, or WFT Original, WFT1, and that is this one right here. This trimmer is designed to trim brass anywhere from 17 caliber all the way up to 338 caliber, and that is because of the size of the cutter. So the cutters that are in here are 4-flute end mill cutters. This happens to be the original from this trimmer, which goes up to the World's Finest Trimmer Original, goes up to 338, but we have 2 different size cutters. So we have a 3/8 shank 5/16 flute cutter that's designed to go up through 6.5 millimeter, and then once you're 270 and higher, we use a straight 3/8 cutter where the shank is 3/8 and the cutter is 3/8 to make sure that the cutter is big enough to have enough cutting surface to cut the end of the brass all the way out to the outer edge of the neck. So the World's Finest Trimmer Original, what that is designed for is for you to pick a certain cartridge that you want to trim, and you buy it for that cartridge. Now, some of these have multiple uses in that the 223 will also cut anything that has the same shoulder diameter and shoulder angle as the 223. So the interchangeability of these trimmers is that if the diameter at the shoulder and the shoulder angle are the same, then the cutter is universal, the trimmer is universal. So like a 223 will also do a triple deuce, a 222 Remington, it'll do a 222 Magnum, it'll do a 221 Fireball. If this were a 308 trimmer, it would do 308, 7mm 08, 260 Remington, 243, anything that has the same shoulder diameter and shoulder angle, it's universal. But the reason guys still love this, even though we have the World's Finest Trimmer number 2 and now the Big Boy, is that once you set the cutter, you're done. You're basically done for the life of that barrel. You don't have to keep adjusting and changing the cutter. Where the difference between the World's Finest Trimmer Original and the 2 is that the 2 has these interchangeable trim chambers on the end. This one happens to be a 257 Roberts. Well, if I wanted to trim something else, we supply a dowel that you can knock out the old one. I'll show you how you do that. So you just loosen these 2 set screws on the side, and then the end mill cutter will come out. You can set that aside, and be careful of these things. They are razor sharp. Even when they're worn out and ready for the trash can, they are still razor sharp. So once you take the cutter out, you can put this dowel in, and it touches the bottom of that trim chamber. Then you just push it on the bench to pop out the old trim chamber. So that was 257 Roberts. Now I can install this one if I want and trim 338 Lapua. And the way we do that is you just line it up with the front of the housing and press down on the bench, and there you go. Now I'm ready for 338 Lapua or whatever else you want to trim. And this trimmer will go up to 460 Weatherby. So this will do everything from the 17s all the way up to 460 Weatherby and anything in between. So that's why a lot of guys like this, because they can buy one housing and then just buy a bunch of different trim chambers and do everything they have. The only downside with that is this has a bigger 1/2 inch cutter, which is why it can go all the way up to 460 Weatherby. But the downside of that is every time you change what cartridge you want to trim, you have to reinstall this and then reset where it needs to be to make sure you get the proper trim length on whatever you're trimming. And I'm not going to go into how to set that up. I'll do that in a different video, how to set up the trimmer originally when you first get it to trim your cases. The long and the short of it is we recommend you have a dummy case that is already trimmed to the length that you want, and then you just set that aside, and that's kind of your gauge going forward to make sure that it trims to the length you want to trim. But there's another way to set it up, and I'll show you how to do that in a different video. This video is just to explain the differences between the trimmers. So again, the number 2, or WFT2 we call it, that can do anything from the 17s all the way up to 460 Weatherby. It takes a little more time to set up, but is no less accurate or efficient than the original, other than the setup time. And then we have the Big Boy, and that is designed a bit different than the other ones in that it has a larger bearing that the trim chambers for that are not a press fit, they slide in, and then you have 2 set screws to set that in place. This trim chamber happens to be for a 50 BMG, so if it does 50 BMG, it's going to do anything up to that. This trimmer, we only make trim chambers from 338 Lapua up to 50 BMG. We don't go below 338 Lapua because it's the Big Boy. It's made for big cases. And a lot of guys will ask, well, what do I need? Do I need the Big Boy or do I need the WFT2? And I would say that if a 338 Lapua is the biggest thing you're going to be trimming and you don't see yourself getting into bigger cases, or maybe, you know, you might go up to a 416 Remington or a 460 Weatherby, then I would say the 2 is perfectly adequate. If the 338 Lapua is the smallest thing that you're going to be trimming, then the Big Boy is a better fit. Like if you intend to get a Chi-Tac down the road, or a 50 BMG or a 416 Barrett, any of the enabler cartridges that Applied Ballistics makes, or you also need this for some of the really long neck British big bore cartridges like the Martinis. Their necks are so long that you need this bigger trim chamber. So even though the cases aren't necessarily as big as a 50 BMG, because the neck is so long, you need this bigger trimmer to trim something like that. And we have all of the different cartridges that can be trimmed with these different trimmers on our website. It's a pretty extensive list. So if you don't see what you have and what you're looking for, give us a call. If we have a reamer, a chamber reamer, then we can make you a trimmer. If we don't have the reamer, then we probably can't make you something unless there's a reamer that we can use and then modify the trim chamber afterwards to work for your application. So this Big Boy trimmer, again, the trim chambers go in a little bit different. They lock down a little bit different. And then the cutter is a 5/8 cutter. So it's a 1/2 inch shank, but then the cutter itself is 5/8 in diameter. So in order to take this one out, instead of going out the back like the number 2, you have to loosen these set screws, and then the cutter has to come out the front because the cutter is actually bigger than the shank, so it has to drop out this way, out the front. You can see that's a serious cutter. So that'll do everything up to, like I said, up to 50 Browning machine gun. And this is a high-speed steel cutter, and those are typically good for 3,000 to 4,000 trims before they need to be replaced. If you were doing various different neck sizes, you might get more trims out of it, but if you did like 4,000 of the same size, you got to think you're constantly working that same part of the cutter. Where if you went from 338 to 375 to 416 to 450 to 50, you're working all the different parts of the edge of that cutter, and it's probably going to last longer. But if you're on one cartridge, again, it's not going to last quite as long. So all of these, all these trimmers, the Big Boy, the number 2, and the original, come standard with a high-speed steel cutter. They're extremely sharp from the factory, and like I said, are good for about 3,000 to 4,000 trims. The number 2, the WFT2, and the WFT original, you can opt for a carbide cutter, and those, when they come, they're not quite as sharp. I mean, they're still razor sharp. They're not quite as sharp right when you get them, but they last longer. Now, how much longer they last, it's tough to say, because again, we don't know if you're trimming multiple different neck diameters. We don't know what RPM you're running it at, so all of these we recommend 1,500 to 2,000 RPM for optimal cutting. They are razor sharp, so after you trim a piece of brass, they don't really leave much of a burr that needs to be taken off. We do still recommend that you chamfer the inside of the mouth and deburr the outside, just for ease of feeding into the rifle and for ease of seating a bullet without shearing any jacket material off. So we do still recommend that you chamfer and deburr, but they do leave a really clean cut, and that's a good way to judge if your cutter is ready to be replaced. So if it's not a pristine flat cut and it looks a little bit jagged, your cutter might be nearing the end of its life. The other thing to consider is that your cutter may be okay, but you want to make sure that you're running it the correct way. So these cutters are only designed to cut one way, which is clockwise, just like a drill bit or if you were putting in a screw. So we recommend a cordless drill with high and low, because on high, you're typically in that 1750 RPM range, which is kind of the sweet spot. So before you start trimming, you want to make sure that your drill is in fact going clockwise. And that's how you know it's the cutter spinning the right way, and it's going to trim the brass really nice and clean. If you do run it the wrong way, you'll know immediately, because the cut is, you're going to feel cavitation and it's not going to cut that well. It will still cut it, but it's going to take longer and the cut's not going to be nearly as nice. And if you do that, if you accidentally run it the wrong way, you may drastically shorten the life of the cutter too. So it's pretty important that you run it the correct way. What else? I think that kind of covered the 3 different versions of the trimmer. How to use them. So we really recommend that you use a cordless drill. A lot of guys call and ask if they can use it in a drill press. You can. It wasn't really designed for that. So the shavings will accumulate around the bottom of the cutter, and they'll start to fall out the trim chamber, and they can cause interference issues with you trying to get the brass up to the correct point. So you can use it in a drill press, but it wasn't really designed that way. It was designed to be used horizontally. So a cordless drill, if you happen to be fortunate enough to have a machine lathe, you can certainly chuck it up in your lathe and do it that way. I know some guys do that, like Gavin Gear, Ultimate Reloader on YouTube. His name's Gavin Gear. He uses our products, or at least he has in the past, and I know he uses them in a lathe because he happens to have one. So you can certainly do that. We get calls now and then where guys want to put it in like a bench grinder or a die grinder, and they're way too high RPM. Again, that sweet spot is 1,500 to 2,000 RPM. They're not designed to be used higher than that, and you're going to get an inferior end result. You can use what I call a wrist breaker, which is like a 1/2 horsepower drill. But again, now your RPMs are too low. Like a 1/2 horsepower corded drill is going to be like 850 RPM. Does it work? Yes. Is it optimal? No. So again, it was designed around using a cordless drill, and just to show you how effective a product it is, we'll demo it right here. So as far as, if you have it already set for the trim length that you need, it's just a simple matter of tightening it into your drill, making sure that it's running clockwise, which it is. And then for those of you that are familiar with the old style crank trimmers, you know, the Lyman or RCBS crank trimmers, you know how slow those things are. This is where this product really shines, is the speed. So this, without getting in too much of a hurry, I'll just show you how fast it can trim. And I'll typically, when I push the piece of brass in, I will turn it a little bit just in case there's any amount of run out in your trimmer. There typically isn't, but just to make sure it gets a nice flat smooth cut, I will turn it a little bit. So stand by. That was 10 pieces of brass, and that was certainly under a minute. So, and then how consistent does it trim the brass? So you can see it's a super nice, clean cut. I'm hoping you can see that. Beautiful finished product. How consistent is it? Well, it's only as consistent as your brass is from the shoulder up to the top of the case neck. So a lot of people don't know this, but when you put a loaded round into your rifle, the round has to be smaller than the chamber in your barrel, otherwise you couldn't get it in there. How much smaller? Well, your average cartridge, it might be 3 to 5 thousandths smaller than the chamber to the shoulder. A 7 Rem mag or a 300 Win mag, if you're putting factory ammo in there, it could be as much as 12 thousandths shorter than the chamber, maybe even 14. Well, sometimes you don't get that much stretch on the first firing. So what I have been recommending to people is that to make sure that your brass is ready to be trimmed, meaning that when you trim it, they're all going to be the same length, is to measure, put it in the trimmer and then measure from the back of the piece of brass to the top of the housing. So if you push your brass in there and then you measure from here to here, you would do this with the cutter removed. So you take the cutter out, stick your brass in there, and then measure this dimension, and then check another piece, measure it, check another piece, measure it. However consistent that measurement is how consistent your brass is going to be to length. So if they're all the same length when you measure them this way, they'll all be the same length when you trim them. Because the trimmer only knows from the shoulder to the mouth, that's all it knows, and that's how it cuts. It has no idea what the distance is from here to there. So if your brass is all different sizes from there, from the shoulder to the base, then your lengths are going to be all different sizes when you're done. So before you trim, we recommend you take your brass, check 10 or 20 pieces, take the cutter out, and then stick them in there and measure with your calipers from there to there and see how consistent they are. They're going to be different in length before you trim them. They'll be all over the place, but that doesn't really matter because this measures to the shoulder. So you take a sized piece of brass. All these trimmers are designed to work on sized brass that's already been sized after firing. Put it in there, measure from here to here. If they're all within 1,000th, they'll all be within 1,000th after you trim them. So I think that's about it. I'll probably do a video on setup on how to set the cutter length initially if you don't have a dummy case, because a lot of people don't. But that'll be for another video. So thanks for checking us out. If you're curious about any of our products, check us out on littlecrowgunworks.com, and check out our YouTube channel. If you're not subscribed, please do so. Check out what else we have over there. We're doing a lot of different projects and constantly working to build that video database. So thanks for checking this out. We'll see you guys on the next video.